Welcome to the second module for the Global DARE Foundation Patient Collaborator Training Series. My name is Mousumi Bose, and I will be your narrator throughout these training modules to help you become an active patient collaborator in ongoing and upcoming research for adult refsum disease. In this module, I will introduce the clinical research process and emphasize the role of patient collaboration throughout this process. This emphasis will show what impact incorporating the community voice into clinical research can have on that community. And speaking of emphasis, first and foremost, one of my goals for this module is to really distinguish a patient collaborator from simply a research participant. I will start by saying that a patient collaborator is so much more than a research participant in a clinical trial. Yes, a patient collaborator can be a research participant within a clinical trial, but patient collaborators have so much more say in the research that they might be participating in, and that's really why we're developing these training modules, to foster this empowerment of more patient collaborators who can really help drive research forward in adult refsum disease to have the most meaningful impact on patients. Before we can talk about clinical research in rare diseases like adult refsum, I think it's important to define some terms. First, let's talk about what scientific research is. Basically, a scientific research study is an organized, standardized process that is aimed to answer a question, aka research question, about a certain topic, using existing information available as well as new information that is collected through the research process. This new information collected during the research process is referred to as data. This data is then summarized and interpreted within the context of the research question and other existing data. So when we're talking about clinical research, this is referring to any scientific research study that involves human participants as part of the data collection process. When conducting clinical research in rare disease, in general, the overarching research objectives are related generally to a couple of things. Number one, understanding the causes of a rare disease. Number two, understanding the course of a rare disease trajectory over time. Or number three, understanding the best approaches to treat a rare disease, or some combination of all of these three items. These objectives usually translate into doing studies that address several questions. First, what are the best ways to screen for or diagnose a rare disease, and how can the diagnostic process be carried out in the most efficient way? Next, what are the symptoms and the impacts of a rare disease on a diagnosed individual and or their families? How do they change as the individual ages and or the disease progresses? This is actually referred to as the natural history of a disease, and we will look into the specifics of natural history studies in a later module. Next, how can we prevent the onset of certain disease manifestations of a rare disease? Given the fact that many rare diseases like adult refsum are genetic and inherited at birth, there's not much we can do about the prevention of developing the disease itself. That's usually not a modifiable factor. However, there may be some things that can be done to prevent the onset of a specific symptom of a rare disease, and some research in rare disease may focus on that as a research goal. And finally, how can we treat a rare disease to minimize its impact on the quality of life of patients and families affected by this disease? Questions related to this topic may address how well a treatment works, how safe it is, and what are the possible side effects, and how accessible is this treatment option to all members of a community, including the more underserved populations within that community. So here is an overview of the clinical research process. As I said before, the heart of all clinical research is a research question that scientific researchers want to answer. But before the development of that research question, you need to take into account what is already known about a topic that you want to address, as well as what is unknown about that topic. This assures that the research study, which if you don't know yet, I'll tell you now, can be very long and require a considerable amount of funding, is not repeating any research that's already been done. And this really allows for a thorough understanding of the topic so that we can ask the most informed research question. Once you have that well-informed research question, then you need to address the best way to actually answer that question. And that's really where the development of study design comes in. A study design is a comprehensive plan that outlines the methods and procedures used to collect and analyze data for a specific research question. It acts as a blueprint for the study, ensuring a logical and systematic approach to gathering information and answering the research question. All of the previous steps prior to study design will really actually dictate what is the most appropriate study design for a specific research study. For example, if you find in one of your earlier steps that there's not really a lot known about a particular topic that you want to research, then you might choose to do an observational study where you're simply observing a population to better characterize them, their disease, or analyze specific details about their lived experiences. If there is already a lot known about a topic that you choose to research, you may want to do an experimental study, which, like I have said earlier, is where a researcher would request study participants to change some aspect of their daily life to see what impact that change would have on them. We will go over the specifics of different study designs in the next module. So once the framework of that study design has been confirmed, then the details of that study design need to be determined and hashed out. How long is the study? Who are the subjects and what criteria do they need to fill? What are you monitoring and measuring from these subjects that participate in your study? How are you measuring it? How often are you measuring it? Once you have these details of your study design hashed out, then it's time to think about how to recruit patients to your study. Before the actual recruitment process, however, it's important to remember that prior to any interaction with potential human subjects in your research, you need to submit a document describing your study design and protocol to an institutional review board, or IRB. We'll talk about this more throughout the different modules, but essentially, an IRB is an external body outside of your study that determines whether or not your study protocol keeps your study participants as safe as possible and ensures that they experience minimal to no distress while participating in your study. The IRB is also responsible for comprehensively evaluating a research plan and study design for privacy protection of participants and maintaining the confidentiality of their data throughout all stages of the research process, from recruitment to data analysis to storage. As I said, we'll talk more specifically about the IRB process in future modules as we go through the details of clinical research studies. So for recruitment, many studies will do public announcements in local institutions via flyers, ads, posts on social media. But most of the time, for studies that need rare disease patients and families, usually you have to partner with community leaders and organizations like the Global DARE Foundation to help disseminate information about new studies that are recruiting for participants. So once you have your participants and they've provided consent to take part in your study, and that's also something that's coordinated with IRB approval, you can begin your data collection based on your study design. Once that data is collected and analyzed, then the findings from that data are interpreted to determine what is the answer to the original research question. And if your conclusions are used to implement some sort of change in current practice, then this process will eventually start all over again, asking a new research question such as, is this change in practice actually improving the quality of life and conditions for its target audience? So this is just a brief overview of this clinical research process. I will go over more specific details about the types of clinical research that are relevant to rare diseases like adult refsum as we dig deeper into these modules. but I want to provide this framework within the context of this value of the patient and community collaboration, which I will definitely touch upon throughout this module. So, in order to understand the importance of patients and community collaboration in clinical research, we need to understand all of the stakeholders that are involved in the clinical research process. First, for those of you that may be unfamiliar with the concept of what a stakeholder is, basically a stakeholder is anyone that is either affected by or has an interest in the thing that they're a stakeholder for, like clinical research. So this definition should show you why the patient community is a stakeholder in the clinical research process. But what this image that is presented here is meant to show you is that is exactly why patient and community collaboration is so important in the clinical research and the clinical trial process. Patients and families aren't just any old stakeholder in the clinical research process. They are the actual target that these other stakeholders want to serve. So, like I said, at the center of this of clinical research in terms of these stakeholders, we've got our patients and families. Beyond patients and families, as stakeholders in clinical research, it's also important to recognize the clinicians providing care to these patients, the researchers evaluating the care for patients, the insurance companies that are providing coverage for care in patients, and the regulatory, government, and policy officials that make the rules and policies surrounding clinical care for patients. So here's the thing, though. Although patients and their families are clearly the central stakeholders in clinical research, the majority of the time, it's the other stakeholders that are actually leading that clinical research process, at least historically. It's usually the researchers that initiate the clinical research process, and when it comes time to evaluate the research to determine whether or not a potential new treatment should be put on the market, that's generally determined by the regulatory stakeholders. And while any clinical research is based on one central research question that could very easily apply to all stakeholders, how that question is framed when you actually present your research question may vary from stakeholder to stakeholder based on their specific interests. So if you have a foundational research question that asks, what is the best treatment option for a patient with a certain rare disease? If you ask the patient stakeholder, they may want to know how do these treatments affect their daily lives. If you are a clinician or a healthcare provider stakeholder, you may want to know if the treatment effect is going to be the same for all of the patients that you treat. If you are a researcher stakeholder, and this is also the case for those affiliated with insurance companies, they may want to know, how does this treatment compare to other existing treatments? And if you are a policy or a regulatory official, you may want to know, what are the appropriate outcomes to determine the effectiveness of a treatment? So put all of these pieces together. What clinical research and clinical trials, at least historically, having been primarily in the hands of clinicians, researchers, regulators, who all have slightly different questions that they want answered in the clinical research process. What they have done is not leave a lot of room for patients and families to be involved in this clinical research process. Historically, the major role of patients in clinical research have been primarily as subjects. And this is after the study design has already been determined, and certainly after the specific research question related to the study has been finalized. And so what happens when you have patients who should be the central stakeholders in the clinical research process have minimal to little input in the design of that clinical research process. When you set out to improve the quality of life in patients without even taking into account what quality of life constitutes to patients, you run a significant risk of not achieving the outcomes that you set out to achieve in your research. And this results in costly clinical trials that fail, which hinders the overall therapeutic development process and ultimately can really foster mistrust between patients and the other stakeholders. And this is exactly why there is this recent emphasis in patient and family collaboration and research. Once again, the shared goal across all stakeholders is to deliver the best treatment to the patient community. But with this patient focus, this emphasis, the clinical research process leans into this idea of patient-centric healthcare and management that results in the best possible outcomes for the patient and their surrounding community. And this involved evaluation of clinical outcomes that matter most to patients, like what are the symptoms that impact the daily life of a patient the most? What are the available treatments for the symptom, and do they work effectively? Are there any side effects? Is there a need for newer and better treatments? Overall, it's these topics where patient and community collaborators are regarded as the experts. And that's what this patient family community collaboration approach is really trying to leverage. So here we're revisiting two previous slides and putting them together in this one slide. In the previous module, I had talked generally about what patient collaborators have the ability to do. And now I want to put that information alongside the clinical research process so that you can see where some of these activities that patient collaborators may choose to do fit within the context of the clinical research process. So, for example, sharing your lived experience as a patient or prioritizing needs can serve as the background information required to develop a meaningful research question. Patient feedback on clinical outcome measures um, can provide important insight on study design. Giving input on the best ways to engage with the patient, with your patient community, or even using your platform to promote awareness of new studies with your community are crucial in study recruitment, particularly for the rare disease community. Being a reference point to look at data interpretation can give an important perspective to researchers in terms of how to interpret their findings. And finally, reporting back to share the impacts of newly implemented policies and practices give great indications to what is the real impact of evidence-based alterations in policy and practice. So lastly, I want to revisit this case study of Kasha Morris, who I hope at this point you've had a chance to listen to her story. And I want to round out this module by applying her story and her active partnership with other research stakeholders in shaping research for her rare disease community. So if you recall from this video, Kasha observed her son with his disease, Tango 2 deficiency disorder, having good days when he would take his multivitamin supplement and bad days when he didn't. Kasha and her family shared this information with clinicians and researchers, and because of that, in a nutshell, less than 10 years later, there are now published studies that have observed an association of B vitamin intake and the occurrence of symptoms within this disease, simply because she recorded her son's experience in a journal and used her voice to share these findings. And now there's an effort to capture more patient voices in the determination of what is actually the optimal daily dose of B vitamins necessary to manage certain symptoms in this disease. So here in this particular community, there is this movement towards the development of new research questions using that active patient collaboration to shape what that next step in research is going to be. So just as before, I'm sharing with you the planned agenda for the upcoming training modules for this program. Up next, we will delve a little deeper into the clinical research study design process, highlighting specific study designs that are relevant to rare disease, and that includes the patient registry study as well as natural history studies, both of which are important stepping stones towards clinical trials for new treatments. And later, we will discuss the clinical trial process and the approval process for new treatments. So I want to thank you for your time. And I'm going to ask you to make sure that you take the survey that is associated with this module. I look forward to continuing to be your guide through these modules. See you next time. If you have any questions about this module or this training series, please contact the Global DARE Foundation.